In the forest, I hear voices. I pick them up most clearly in the places where the plants grow wildest, and the pathways seem to disappear. When their calls fill my ears, blocking out all other sounds, I know I'm home. Shaman hear voices too. They soar through the air in their dreams, magically unhinged from gravity. I stay tethered, though, as I'm dragged against the woodland current, slipping through voids between tree trunks pulled strongly inward by the forest's nucleus. Voices, all shouting from the mouths of weeds. The voices are breathy murmurs carried on the wind. The voices spill out from tossed foliage. The voices disguise themselves behind the creaks and grunts of tottering branches. The voices scrape against each other and snap. The voices underlie the cacophony of cicadas and frogs. The voices are a relentless, buzzing orchestra. The voices advance from invisible places above and below. I think maybe when my grandfather was alive, he heard voices too, although we did not talk about it. Why else would he build his cabin so ridiculously far from the city, in the middle of nowhere? I look up. The sun is blocked by the thick arboreal dome above, but the forest's architecture is restless and unfixed. Warm patches of light start to crack through as the leaves start to flutter in rolling waves. Each flashes a silver blue underbelly. My grandfather was a dentist. He spent his days peering into gaping mouths of patients, prodding around through gum and tooth in search of sunken areas. Some of the voices that spoke to him were from the vaulted fuchsia mouths of people. But not always. Sometimes voices in green velvet scabbards. Sometimes voices weeping from satin faces lifted towards the sun. Sometimes voices with leaves tinged coral and apricot, dropping, falling, reverberating in the rotten gray tooth of his unaware patient. And so skilled he was that simultaneously he could grasp that crescent moon of a tooth and the floating voice, extracting them both with the jaws of his hands. Now they were his to manipulate. I picture him, hunched over the faces of patients, pressing them open into ever-widening apertures, decoding their muffled grunts alongside that sometimes voice, prickly from the bramble, lancing out to snag hair and scratch face. A person's mouth is a gateway. My grandfather, the dentist, must have traveled to many places I couldn't even imagine. Nostalgia is a very nice neighborhood with one too many backyards. Even so, I'm taking you back to my childhood, but not as a sweet remembrance. Instead, think of us as planets rotating past something familiar. Cement walkways extended for miles, governing our experience with nature through control and compartmentalization. I was a yard bird growing up in the suburbs. I remember the interchangeable lawns, all the same shade of green, all mowed to the perfect height, with blustering sprinklers proclaiming through daily chatter, cherish the mundane. Voices coming up from a crack in the cement. Voice, against all odds, still calling out, scraggly and strained and colored like a mantis. The voices grew bolder, tiptoeing in between the measured heights of grass blades, a whisper from 2 houses over. Practically unintelligible, the voices were formless and embryonic. Soon, though, they were the still budding voices of springtime greenery, emerging a fresh limey color in sturdy stripes. Then they were angry, rhizomatic voices doing the work of widening, scuttling under the September earth. October voices, coiling upwards, grasping at diaphanous light. Next, the mumbling, vaporous voices of November, and the soft crunch of them underfoot. Their messages didn't really matter. The connection was established. In the deep green carpet of suburbia, I suddenly knew this voice like a shivering blemish. And how I hated it. Something happened on Halloween that changed me. I spent the day hiding in my astronaut helmet, so desperate to believe it would block out the voices. It didn't matter, though. One house took me by surprise. A pathetic thing. Just an abandoned, crumbling rattletrap. That wasteland of a yard made me its satellite. As it held me in its gravity, it didn't just speak to me. It sang to me, like a siren holding me in place. I watched the house and felt the horror of a glacier melting back into the ground, and the joy of a black hole devouring itself. It reminded me, everything is in the process of decomposition. The ground will devour the house. The ground will devour us all just the same. I think I died then and there, disintegrating like the house back to the soil, my blood now pulsing in the veins of weeds. I didn't know my grandfather. He was gone by the time I was born. But I can see pieces of myself echoed in the photograph of him at the cabin. Afternoon propels itself with a stringent yellow light. The aubergine shadows of trees stretch crabwise, cutting slants through the leaf-strewn embankment. And Grandpa sitting there, separate from the world of the rest of us, but connected to something distant beyond the trees. I pretend that I can hear the cheery call of the photographer singing out, and the click of a camera shutter, interrupting him as he was sliding down the diagonal hypotenuse of his mind and plunging into some shadow territory. I never liked the city. A rigid scaffold, an inflexible grid that leaves your body feeling tiny and crowded and awkward. But when we visited the cabin, we drove past the city. And headed northward through the countryside for what seemed like an eternity. As all the puritanical suburban sidewalks disappeared, I wondered how anyone got anywhere. Lawns gave way to a leafy overgrowth, all plants reminiscent of ones that would have been killed back home in the neighborhood's perfect patchwork of green. Gradually, overgrowth gently folded into thicket, and thicket widened into forest. And then we were there. I am on a lawless plot of forest and rock, covered with a swarm of tall grass, creepers, and shoots. The light seeps through a citadel of lawless stems that meet me face to face. Leaves and nettles hiss as they rub against each other in the breeze. Voices float to me from the rampant hair of the ground, a lush emerald cowlick leaping up with an endless confusion of vines. Underfoot, inky, aphotic soil gathers in clumps, asphyxiating a boneyard of roots, gristly and wrinkled. And my God, how this savage landscape emphatically shouts to me. Each and every plant clamoring for my attention, as if they had been waiting 1,000 lifetimes for my arrival.